to the Oregon Bioethics and Humanities Colloquium presentation, Medical Mistrust, Conceptual Insights and Empirical Challenges. My name is Cliff Coleman with the OHSU Center for Ethics in Healthcare. I co-chair this series along with Dave Hoyt, who's also with us today. Today's talk continues our 2025-2026 Oregon Bioethics and Humanities Colloquium, or OBHC. OBHC is a 7-part endowed speaker series that tackles complex issues and critical questions in bioethics and the medical humanities. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our presenter today. Dr. Alyssa Newman is a senior research scholar and assistant professor of sociology at Georgetown University's Kennedy Institute of Ethics. Her research currently focuses on assisted reproductive technologies and institutional solutions to racial health disparities. She has published extensively on multiraciality, exploring the topic through a variety of research projects relating to collective identity formation, biology and genetics, the intersection of mixedness and masculinity, immigration, as well as relationships and reproduction. Her work can be found in esteemed journals such as the New England Journal of Medicine and many others. Dr. Newman received her undergraduate degree in sociology from the University of California, Berkeley, and her PhD in sociology with an emphasis in Black studies from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alyssa Newman.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the lovely introduction. Thank you for the invitation, and thanks to everyone for joining for this talk. I'll go ahead and put my slideshow up to share with you all, and we can get started. Okay. Okay, does it look good? Does it look all right?
Looks great.
Okay, perfect. So yes, as mentioned, I've titled the talk today, Medical Mistrust, Conceptual Insights and Empirical Challenges. I'm trying to think through some work that I wrote in 2021, but also trying to incorporate all the changes around these topics that are happening in the current moment. And kind of the first place to pick up is also the place where I left off, which is thinking about the limitations conceptually of the mistrust framework, or maybe sort of trust in related and adjacent concepts, as well as the empirical challenges that arise from that. So hopefully we'll get a chance to explore that a little bit today, and then I'll hear some questions from you. By first means, I just will say that I have no conflicts of interest and nothing to disclose. And I believe you already have seen some of the objectives for the talk today, but thinking about some of the conceptual confusions between trust, mistrust, and distrust, thinking about related concepts, I'll try to do as much as possible without just reading definitions to you all, and then thinking about mistrust within interpersonal and institutional contexts. And for a background about me, I think you already heard a little bit, but I have a PhD in sociology with a doctoral emphasis in Black studies. I did postdocs in science and technology studies and bioethics. And I'm trying to have all of these things inform this conversation. And so just a background knowledge for you to think about the different ways that all of these disciplines approach these very same topics. And I'm trying to lend them to the medical mistrust conversation. So first, I think I'll try to cover what medical mistrust is and give us a little bit of the conceptual challenges. I'll turn to my prior work on COVID and Black communities as just an illustration and an example of thinking through some of the conceptual and empirical disconnects and sort of how I thought through those things in the past, which will be sort of this critiquing of the mistrust framework and towards institutional analyses. And then in the limited time that we have, I'll try to talk a little bit or turn our attention to new constraints and realities in the contemporary moment related to these topics. So this is just a collection of some pandemic era headlines that drew me to writing and thinking about the topic. All of this would probably look very familiar to you, thinking about being fueled by a history of mistreatment, Black Americans distrust COVID-19 vaccines. The healthcare system has failed Black Americans. No wonder many are hesitant, and sort of this challenges of overcoming mistrust. These are summer 2025 plus headlines. Hard to keep up with all of the possible headlines that could make it to this slide, but thinking about different things that have been happening, like freezing clinical trials mid-trial, cutting and the uncertainty related to that, the prospect of an autism study and sort of privacy violations, lifting protections against immigration enforcement in schools, churches, hospitals, and other sensitive areas. And then, of course, more recently, remaking CDC panels about vaccine guidance and those changes. So all of these are definitely related, definitely feeding into the same questions. And I guess the question that I'd like to pose is sort of thinking about all these different headlines that might capture some aspect of trust and mistrust and distrust. What do they have in common? How to respond to a crisis of trust on multiple fronts? And firstly, thinking about recognizing the interconnectedness of issues related to trust and concerns related to trust, the conceptual difficulty of matching concerns, all of these things that might fall under the trust umbrella, to appropriate ways to test, measure, study, and compare, suggesting the limits of individual actions, but also the possibilities of more transformative interventions. And I think there's also a question here of how much we're pushing the trust concept, and are we asking too much of it, if it's supposed to be able to capture and address all of these things. To think about the medical mistrust concept itself, and sort of some assumptions that are undergirding this arena. And I come to this by way of talking with some of my other colleagues in sociology here at Georgetown, realizing that a lot of us have actually been writing about trust in our different contexts. And so one of those is studying special education programs and schools and class differences, and resource differences between parents and how they navigate that context. Another has studied wartime movement of money and financial exchange. And so in these conversations, we're kind of generating, well, here's some assumptions or normal baselines that we think these conversations look like in these various contexts. So to me, I think as I read the mistrust literature, whether that's in academic literature, or maybe it's even considering how headlines address these types of topics, we sort of think of trust as the normal, regular functioning of things. We've come to have the expectation, baseline assumption that there's trust in medicine, and that's how it functions best. And anytime that it doesn't, it's a little bit of a aberration that we probably should explain why it's aberrant, why it's deviating from the norm. And then, of course, we focus a lot on the negative consequences that might stem from it. So even when we recognize it as rational, as a lot of those headlines from the pandemic era did, it's still harmful and counter to health. So we still want to intervene and try to shift or change it. We identify the disposition itself being mistrustful, or maybe sometimes redirect it to say there's a problem of trustworthiness to address. But either way, we see it as something that's harmful, counter to health, and want to intervene and change that aspect of the relationship. And as I've already sort of introduced, in other contexts, such as financial matters, this exchange of money, this dependence, we grant people in that realm sort of like suspicion and mistrust should be your approach. This is the default. People need to do a lot of things to, or be extremely vulnerable in order to trust in those contexts. So I'm just really inspired by bringing that kind of difference in default assumptions to this conversation. Thinking through what the presumption of trust is built on in this conversation related to medical mistrust. And again, asking this question, is it perhaps too broad to encompass everything we're asking of it? Here are a couple, just a brief selection of different ways that different scholars have defined trust. If you can take a second to glance at them, or just think about some of the parallels or similarities and differences between all of these definitions. But here, this is pulled from, I believe, a recent summary of the mistrust and trust literature specific to like nursing, public health realm. Um, and that says trust refers to a patient's expectation that healthcare providers and institutions will act in their best interest. Creary and Garrido, they wrote this piece in the Hastings Center report, I believe, a special issue, but they're broadening to more institutional concerns. So trust for our context here concerns the extent to which community members believe that an institution is trustworthy and will take into account their best interests when making decisions. Other kind of broader definitions, the willingness to make oneself vulnerable to the actions of another party, willingness to be vulnerable under conditions of risk and uncertainty. So you can see here, there's some parallels in terms of thinking about maybe the significance of vulnerability, this risk, this idea of dependence, and also maybe other definitions that kind of shift about thinking about what people are giving up, what people are willing to sacrifice when they trust. And because I'm here at the Kennedy Institute, which is sharing a floor with the Pellegrino Center for Clinical Bioethics, thinking about what's special, what kind of vulnerabilities, what kind of contexts are involved in the provider-patient relationship, just such a peculiar constellation of urgency, intimacy, unavoidability, unpredictability, and extraordinary vulnerability. And this certainly aligns with a lot of definitions of trust that try to underscore the idea of risk, the idea of vulnerability, and how central they are to understanding trust. And I think that this is a realm that also is able to highlight that kind of uniquely. And then just to draw our attention briefly to some prior sociological research, thinking about just like where medical authority comes from, how we have developed this kind of expert knowledge, and then kind of vulnerabilities and dependence relationships. Paul Starr, in this kind of classic 1982 book, The Social Transformation of American Medicine, thinks through ideas like control, authority, and what other concepts help build those things up. In the book, he overviews, and this is something that I like to teach to my sociology of health and illness class a lot, thinking about sort of the different aspects of control. So legitimacy is a question of why people should obey and buying into those explanations, whereas dependence more deals with the consequences that will occur if people do not obey. So when we think about things like non-adherence, non-compliance, something that often is driving that is not necessarily the legitimacy question, but more of a dependence question, or more of a lack of alternative options, or failure to adhere or failure to comply might also correspond to those very same limitations. Also thinking about types of authority, so social authority, control of action through the giving of commands, as well as cultural authority, ability to define reality, judgments of meaning and value come to prevail as being valid and true. And if we're thinking about disregarding information from, credentialed, licensed people with expertise, a classic hallmark of medicine's power and authority in the past has been to shape patients' understanding of their own experience. And I think that's a good starting point to think through maybe how some of these presumptions of trust or presumptions of how the relationship will work start to break down. I guess first, certainly through the example of Black Americans and the long histories that contribute to the mistrust conversation that culminated in that sort of pandemic moment and vaccination question, as well as thinking about what types of challenges are being brought forth, what type of questioning is being brought forth about different topics in the current moment. And then not to go too deep in the weeds and just share definition after definition, but I think it is important to at least address the distinction that scholars have come to bear, which, to be fair, oftentimes there's a conflation between mistrust and distrust, and they're used sort of interchangeably. but it might be useful to just acknowledge that some try to distinguish between the concepts and refer more often to mistrust as sort of the general sense of unease, suspicion, a kind of more abstract, not directed, mistrustful, wary approach. In contrast to distrust, which has been identified as more kind of targeted, more specific, not based on sort of more abstract things, but more concrete things. And so oftentimes that's brought into the conversation as well. And again, you see another trust definition, and here, of course, the trustworthiness question is important. I'll also address that a little bit later in this talk, but thinking about the relationship between truster and trustee and conceptualized as something that can be an attribute of an entity. And I think all of these definitions provided here, also contested definitions, whether, mistrust is the absence of trust, or whether that can be a continuum, or if it's its own separate concept with its own kind of logics. Those are also debates that are happening about this. So I present this as sort of just informational background, but if you read systemic review after systemic review about these topics, there's basically a consensus that there's too many definitions and too little agreement. So this is what I offer this to you with. And to think specifically about medical mistrust and Black communities, this is, again, what brought me to writing and thinking about this topic. This is very much kind of to bring us back to a 2021 moment and the conversations that were happening. Some of those debates were about what are the sources of this mistrust, thinking about historical versus contemporary, thinking about what to do about it and how to respond. How much does it account for racial disparities in vaccination rates, and questioning whether this is even a fair and accurate terminology. And again, a lot of this commentary, a lot of this thought is coming from, media, television, sort of the popular realms and debates that are happening there, as well as different conversations within scholarship. So like the New England Journal of Medicine, like other kind of scholarly journals, these were sort of the debates that were undergoing in both realms. And as sort of a bit of a refresher, some of this speaks to, historical versus contemporary. It's just Tuskegee, word of mouth, generalized, speaking more to the mistrust kind of concept, not necessarily rooted in personal experience. The way to address that type of mistrust would be towards historical accuracy, moving towards reconciliation. But then a lot of people in this moment were also arguing it's actually based on personal experience. We don't have to abstract. People have everyday experiences of medical racism that they can draw on that contributes to this sense of mistrust or distrust of medicine. And there were certainly a lot of debates, potentially unhelpful, to say it's either or instead of both and. But nevertheless, a lot of attention was given to both tracks. And again, I think in large part, a lot of these grant legitimacy to these arguments, to these reasons and these reasoning, but nevertheless, there is a big problem in terms of the consequences of mistrust that is being highlighted through these conversations. I put here sort of a couple of sample headlines about, what captures this debate. So why Tuskegee slowed vaccinations of Black Americans. You see in that headline directly correlating Tuskegee itself to lower vaccination. Another headline, but arguing kind of like, again, suggesting this dynamic, stop blaming Tuskegee. It's not an excuse for current medical racism. So positing this current moment versus arguments that are more historical. And then as well, since those are sort of New York Times and NPR, there's also this kind of types of headlines happening in New England Journal of Medicine. And then related to those conversations, there was this emerging question about what to do and how to respond. Some of those responses involved using Black doctors and scientists to provide messaging and outreach. So perhaps they would be the best messengers, spokespersons to specifically targeting Black communities who are mistrustful to encourage them to get vaccinated for COVID. Also the circulation of a lot of individual strategies of how to address people in general who were hesitant to get the COVID vaccine. So listening to them, validating their hesitations and mistrust, hopefully seeing them more than one time and being able to coax them over time towards that direction, or at least make them comfortable, or at least feel that all of their questions could be resolved and answered. And then as well as is depicted in the photo here, which is like providing community specific targeted efforts. So perhaps led by Black doctors, researchers, but also locating them in particular communities and targeting targeted efforts towards if people won't come to us, maybe we can set up resources that will be there for you. I wrote about this in this moment in 2021, thinking about, maybe some problems with that approach, especially using Black physicians or researchers as representatives, because I think that it relies on those who are very impacted by medical racism, as in being very underrepresented in the profession, to be at the forefront of institutional response to mistrust. So the very people who are often kept out of being part of the institution and who are very minoritized and marginalized within it, then being representatives of this institution and as the institutional response to mistrust. In that piece, I argued that I don't think it actually addressed mistrust at all, but was rather an attempt to circumvent it. So if you don't trust the institution, perhaps we can substitute the trustworthiness or the trust that people might have in these Black professionals. And that would be the thing to convince people to become vaccinated. But again, this doesn't resolve the historical or the contemporary experiences. It's just sort of getting around it, circumventing the issue a little bit. I also argued that it was important to, maybe because it's an emergency moment and there's not a lot of options, and I sort of agree with the urgency of addressing the issue, that maybe it's necessary and there's not much else to do. But thinking about, of course, the long-term consequences, both for those individuals professionally, within their own careers, within a moment that was very taxing, and everyone was overworked and resources were very thin. And so thinking just as this might be emergency response, but this might exacerbate the issues that already exist within the profession. And speaking to others of that debate, this is, a graphic from January 2021, thinking about percentage of Black Americans vaccinated versus the percent of the population. And of course, we see perhaps unsurprisingly huge disparities in that. And that sort of brought up another wave of these debates. How much does medical mistrust account for vaccination disparities? And this brought sort of another realm or another phase, thinking about hesitancy versus access. Perhaps it's not just that Black Americans are mistrustful of the vaccine and don't want to get vaccinated. Perhaps it's just also an opportunity and access question. So having signups be online, having clinics open only during work hours, not resolving issues of transportation, the ways in which, riding the bus to get a vaccine might expose you at the same time that you're trying to remedy things. And so there was this debate thinking about, is it hesitancy, is it access, and sort of arguing over that. And then, of course, it also raised the question of whether it's an accurate or fair term. So how much does mistrust convey a rational, deliberative thought process? And there are a lot of pieces that I read during that moment that added qualifiers to mistrust. So the earned mistrust, the justified mistrust Black Americans have of medicine. Deservedly, they mistrust medical institutions. So either resolving this by adding sort of qualifiers or thinking about the term itself and whether it is actually just kind of conveying this generalized suspicion that's not well grounded, or recognizing sort of like how rational and deliberative it is. And again, I think this comes to the undergirding assumptions of the mistrust conversation. Like this is the default position that we expect, and therefore we have to explain mistrustfulness rather than, oh, and then, or if we are explaining it, we're qualifying it and giving it more credence by adding these qualifiers. And I think that has to do with a lot of the assumptions that undergird the conversation from the start. And also thinking about the broadness of what this concept is conveying. It's putting sort of like the historical anti-vax, sort of general suspicion, general mistrust, perhaps conspiracy believing mistrustful, alongside the people who we say have these well-grounded historical and personal experiential reasons for being mistrustful. So is the concept still as useful if we're trying to describe both of these sets of people or these very different motivations, but we have the same word and same concept? And I think in that moment, it was especially important for me to think about what Black bioethicists have said and have written about these topics. Back in 1997, Vanessa Northington Gamble published a piece that pushed back against the notion that the Tuskegee syphilis study was the most important reasons why many African Americans distrust institutions of medicine and public health. She wrote that the narrowness of such a representation places emphasis on a single historical event to explain deeply entrenched and complex attitudes within the Black community. There's lots of historiographies and pieces and texts that will tell us that there's plenty of historical examples beyond Tuskegee that represent this long kind of tradition and history of experimentation on Black bodies, exploitation of Black bodies, reproductive control over Black bodies. So saying Tuskegee, the United States Public Health Service studied Tuskegee as the sort of one-word explanation to encompass that sort of dismisses the well-embedded historical continuous legacy of many things that are similar, but perhaps not as sensationalized. And then I also drew upon Lavera Crawley's writing from 2001, so 20 years before my own writing, thinking about identifying the locus of mistrust as existing within minorities, framing the issue of trust as something that needs to be cultivated in them, unfairly shifts the burden of change onto these groups. And so thinking about how this might be a question that says, you know, again, the intervention here is to potentially overcome mistrust, to convince people to get vaccinated in this particular moment. But although this is an emergency response in an isolated context, there is this general idea that the mistrustful need to be assuaged and we need to change something within them. And then again, this did bring us to conversations about trustworthiness that were also kind of prominent in this moment. But I think recognizing that some people were pushing us in that direction 20 years prior is very important. So yes, when we think about the introduction of sort of the trustworthiness conversation, there is an attempt there to shift the burden of change back onto institutions or on providers instead of thinking about changing, in particular, maybe the mistrust of Black Americans. And thinking about conceptual interventions, some important questions I was asking at that moment is, when we study mistrust, what exactly are we measuring? And what questions are we asking? Who are we asking it of? What are we studying? These are two systematic reviews that I pulled out. I think in the past couple of years, I can identify many, many more because this topic has been so prevalent within medicine and outside of it as well. And I think a lot of them come to relatively similar conclusions, but some important things to point out about this piece. These pieces here is thinking about, so here's a systematic review of associations between medical mistrust and health outcomes, qualitative and quantitative studies conducted over a 20-year period prior to the pandemic. Most associated mistrust with a behavior response and none focused on an actual health outcome. So meaning, well, I'll go into some examples later, but thinking about mistrust and behavior responses and the way those behaviors are problematized, and not actually thinking about the health outcomes themselves, although that's in the background and the backdrop. This review pointed out that many researchers were sort of silent on the effect of historical injustices and not describing basic causes of mistrust, which again, maybe is important for this conversation, depending on what population you're thinking about, depending on how we want to validate or qualify different forms of mistrust. So again, it's a pretty big concept, and being sort of silent on those things contributes to that issue. And there's this other second systematic review thinking about how mistrust has been measured as a step towards informing health promotion efforts. These are articles published prior to 2016, and they found that mistrust was rarely examined outside of racially marginalized groups, by far most often African Americans. Other forms of marginalization were less than a quarter of the studies in their review. So at least thinking about some of these studies that tried to summarize the literature, think about the focus. When we study mistrust, what are we measuring? We're largely looking at some forms of behaviors, and we're looking at those behaviors mostly among marginalized populations, and those are reflective of the questions that we're asking. Oh. So this is just a very primitive bubble to describe the mistrust framework, which again, a lot of the research suggests that what we're thinking about when we're talking about trust, we're talking about mistrust, is a relationship between an interpersonal relationship, between institutions and individuals, between institutions and communities. So here, thinking through medical institutions and healthcare systems and Black communities and sort of reflecting the idea that it's a relationship. This red here is kind of supposed to indicate sort of like a negative association. So within this mistrust framework, we're identifying a breakdown in this relationship as the problem, as something that's perhaps aberrant or deviant. And so we're identifying, like, yes, it's this relationship and this disconnect that's brewing because of that as the problem. Excuse me. But I think in practice, based on the way that mistrust is studied and who's asked questions and what's being documented, instead of pathologizing the relationship, we often kind of tend to negatively paint Black communities or potentially problematize their behaviors more than we're making an impact on the relationships. So some examples of ways in which that describes Black patients, pulling directly from the systematic reviews or the articles that they included, is that Black patients underutilize healthcare, Black patients exhibit diminished adherence, Black patients have a heavy prevalence of being non-compliant, Black patients do not engage in preventative health practices, Black patients refuse care in the pandemic moment, Black patients do not take the COVID vaccine. And so in practice, what is studied, especially if we're talking about behaviors and not necessarily health outcomes, although we can see clearly these behaviors, and it's not very hard to imagine that they negatively impact health outcomes. But these are the behaviors that end up being highlighted most often when talking about mistrust, in terms of just this underutilization, diminished, non-compliant, ends up framing in a kind of negative, deviant, or non-helpful light these behaviors, which then get attached to Black patients more so than the breakdown of the relationship that produces the mistrust that then produces these types of behaviors. I'll also just add here that I have my own suspicions of thinking about trustworthiness as a resolution, as a way to get out of it, also related to empirical challenges of how this tends to be studied. And so here, I think the idea of shifting the conversation, shifting the burden of change onto medical institutions and healthcare systems is a helpful idea or step towards intervention. But I also think the way that we mostly understand the success of that is, yes, there are potential ways to say, here are trustworthy characteristics or attributes or behaviors, but we don't know if they're actually successful until we look at the perceptions of mistrustful communities, of mistrustful patients. So seeing how Black communities' perceptions change is actually what's kind of understudy, so under the lens of our examination and what we're hoping to change, even though we're changing behaviors on this end. So yes, there is this idea that we're putting the impetus of change onto and shifting that burden onto those systems, but we're only validating and knowing that we're successful if we have changed these behaviors on the other end. So I think that still relates to generally an empirical challenge, because I think and doesn't necessarily highlight the problem. There might be trustworthy characteristics of institutions and providers that doesn't change the broader systematic relationship, the broader interconnections of institutions that would still make these populations behave in mistrustful ways. And one of the ways I tried to think through this in the past was to make a distinction between analyzing versus meaningfully centering marginalized populations. And so one of those examples would be, what do marginalized populations think? How do they behave? And why do they behave that way? The population is studied and paid attention to, but the burden of explanation and change is placed on the marginalized. So again, maybe trustworthiness gets us out of that. The current mistrust framework definitely does that, versus what I think is meaningfully centering populations. So from the perspective of those marginalized populations outward, perhaps how do a different constellation of institutions look like to them? Not delimiting just to a single institution, but perhaps also encompassing broader contexts, thinking about what's normal or aberrant according to their experience. So again, when I had this idea of depicting the relationship and finding sort of this red delimiting sort of like a aberrant or unnormal, non-normal relationship, maybe we can see what this looks like from the view outward, starting from a marginalized population's perspective. So this would be one example of that. And here I'm thinking about how it's sort of normalized to think, okay, here's a constellation of communities that have mistrustful relationships with medicine or, medicine or medical institutions, sexual minorities, immigrants, HIV positive communities, Black communities, and in general, white communities have had a more trustworthy relationship towards medical institutions. So we have sort of green indicating good and positive and normal, and then red indicating these problematic relationships or the ways in which these are breaking down. And I think one important way to study that would, and also center the marginalized populations instead of the institution, would be this example. This is a 2014 study of a sociologist, Sarah Brain. And she was actually interested in studying the criminal justice system, people who've had criminal justice system contact. But the question that she was asking was really of institutions. So she studied this population and thought about institutions that they had attachments to, that they had contact with, that they engaged with, versus institutions that they did not. Especially in this realm of criminal justice, there's a lot of surveillance that takes place, and it's not necessarily just from the criminal justice system or its direct apparatus itself, but the ways in which other institutions of society contribute or participate in that surveillance regime. So for Brain's purposes, she made a distinction between surveilling and non-surveilling institutions, and came up with this concept of system avoidance. And here's what it would look like if I depicted it sort of similarly to what I did for medical institutions a couple slides prior. This is individuals with criminal justice system contact, and what she identified as sort of like, kind of avoiding institutions that those participants tended to avoid versus the ones that they tended to engage with. So if you've had prior criminal justice system contact, you are more likely to avoid medical institutions, educational institutions, financial institutions, and labor market. But places where they did sort of form institutional attachments were religious institutions and civic institutions. And so she's able to then ask a question, making this division, looking at what do medical, educational, financial, labor markets have in common? What do civic and religious institutions have in common? What are the differences between these two groups? And now we're starting to ask questions about institutions and their behaviors and their patterns, and we're not necessarily then focusing on or problematizing the behaviors of those who've had criminal justice system contact. So here you can think about the ways in which she's mapping those that are avoided and those that are participating in. And I'll just go back here. So thinking about what characteristics they had in common, of course, was the fact that they collect names, they collect information. If the criminal justice system came knocking, they could access those records and track people, track their movement, freeze their finances, whatever it may be. So the things that these institutions tended to have in common were the ways in which the criminal justice system was so embedded within them and utilized those institutions versus places like churches or other religious organizations where people didn't necessarily have to provide their name, didn't have to provide a phone number, didn't have to provide an email address in order to receive food or benefits or to participate. And so thinking about that, the ways in which even though these are not, education provides tons of benefits, is not itself punitive or part of the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system does utilize it, and those interconnections are what made people avoid that. So I use that as an example to think about the ways we can actually shift the lens to think about what are the behaviors of institutions and that constellation rather than the behaviors of the people at the center of this map. As much as they're being centered, we've actually been able to shift the focus off of them and think about what the behaviors of institutions are. And just to think about some of the more contemporary moment, mainstream conversations about mistrust, of course, there's this piece that I want to highlight, which is thinking about the relationship between different institutions or organizations or agencies and how, all 6 past Surgeon Generals worked together, despite who appointed them, to warn the nation about RFK Jr. and make this statement, which pretty much says, using our expertise and experience and the record that we have, we don't believe that there's valid information coming out of these organizations. We don't believe that they're, based in evidence or the things that we usually guide our decision making. These are not our institutions functioning as they should. And so there is this broader question of what happens when we have something like expertise and experience running counter to the agencies and organizations that were supposed to be trusted because of the structures that were in place. And I'll just offer in closing sort of maybe a couple of different adjacent concepts that relate to that as well. Especially as we're thinking about the problem of medical mistrust. I think this relates exactly to some of my earlier slides, thinking about the interconnectedness of declines in trust. So this idea of expertise, it's not just medicine, it's also science, it's also, faculties, universities, the waning influence of evidence, which means questioning, erasing, or disregarding, the ways in which this also relates to falling trust in government. Credibility, legitimacy, and solidarity are some concepts that, again, I think these are borrowing from where trust is salient in different ways in regards to different institutions. So the idea of credibility is obviously related to trust, but is a concept kind of most often used in terms of information. Oops, it's supposed to say media. often in terms of information, media, and journalism, sometimes viewed as foundational for trust, something like credibility in agency issuing an evacuation order, how much people trust the information that they're getting, has a lot to do with this concept of credibility. So again, this is obviously related to the realm of medicine, but also kind of a concept that's more central to those with concerns about information journalism and how information circulates. Legitimacy is another one. This is one that centers around governance and policing oftentimes, but obviously still relates to this realm. So the issuing of commands, or at the very least of guidance and recommendations, are seen as valid and proper. Without going too sociological, there's a very Weberian argument that legal rational authority has lessened the need for trust. So we've moved some of that labor from interpersonal relationships to the idea of presenting it as credentials or agencies or something else, which has maybe produced this moment where we have less of a interpersonal trust dependent context. But nevertheless, that's breaking down. And then lastly, solidarity, cutting at questions of distributive justice, thinking about shared struggles, shared goals, and shared sacrifice. And solidarity is very much connected to these questions. And so if we bridge those conversations and bring it into our own concerns, potentially that's helpful. And yeah, I would just point people to thinking about 50 years of trust research in healthcare synthetic review. That's another great place to start to think about all the realms that are studying trust. And one of their major points was thinking about that trust needs to be studied as an outcome and not just an input into the delivery of healthcare. And I think I will just close there to see if there's any questions.
Thank you for that fantastic talk. I'll wait for, well, if folks have comments or questions, please put those in the chat. And I have lots of thoughts and questions, but I'll start us off. It seems like there's this emotionally convenient sort of construct of framing trust, as that sort of othering aspect that you've alluded to so well, and allowing us as agents of a healthcare system to put the burden right on communities, and of course, and that emotional convenience piece of it, that ability for us to avoid that culpability, and the negative feelings that might come with that. I wonder if what sort of challenges that will pose for us as human beings trying to do better within a system. If we were to become, as individuals, we wanted to begin to think more about trustworthiness and less about trust. How are we going to grapple with that as people with our own feelings, emotions, and vulnerabilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's a little bit frustrating to be an agent with limited agency, like there's constraints on our ability to be compassionate, there's constraints on our ability to change policy, there's constraints on um, our ability to, for instance, there's this long-standing protection. One of the headlines I have from earlier in the presentation was about sort of like breaking down this formerly kind of protection against law enforcement crossing into these barriers of, religious institutions, which is one of the ones that came up in the brain study, or in hospitals. So these are things that we can't necessarily control, but did at one point be sort of like off limits, untouchable, different spaces of privilege in relationship to this. And I think relating to that interpersonally is, of course, we like have our capacities as professionals and in our occupations, and also as people, as human beings. And so, yeah, I think I hate to give this talk and be like, it doesn't matter what people do because there's institutions. And as a sociologist, I think we're very guilty of doing this all the time. So I'm constantly being corrected by my students and letting them correct me. But I think it takes the institutional and the interpersonal. I think both things in conjunction. I would never push back against making efforts on both and all fronts in all ways. And I think that's sort of the best answer that I have, is that it definitely takes the resistance that might feel meaningful to you as an individual and give you enough sort of energy to move towards the next day, as well as these broader struggles that we watch unfold. And yeah.
I appreciate that. I think one of our main missions here at OHSU, of course, is educating next generation of healthcare professionals. And I'm curious. I think we've started to try to embrace some of these concepts that you've raised for us today. This idea of again trust versus trustworthiness. But I know we're facing kind of an uphill task in trying to teach that, try to help our younger our learners who are just entering the field to be able to embody that attitude, which is quite different than I think the overwhelming attitude of the system, which says I believe the system says trust should be expected in us.
Mm.
And I think that myself, I'll speak for myself, coming into healthcare, I certainly, looking back on it, believed that people should start from a position of trust in me. And I'm questioning that, but I'd like to think maybe we should begin with our learners, on day one, really trying to flip that framework. I wonder if you have experience with that or thoughts about how educators would begin to try to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's taken me, I'm like several years, even post PhD, to understand like why the degree means what it is and who's validating that and who's upholding it, right? It's my PhD granting institution, but my PhD is granted also with the approval of my committee members who evaluated me, and there are other institutions that evaluated them and issued them that credential. The process of peer review is a little bit of a mystery to people who send, papers out into the abyss and get something back. And so I think it's not very obvious to people, or if I'm trying to explain it to my family, here's the gold standard, here's why peer review matters. Like all of those things are not necessarily very meaningful to people. We're definitely in an age of kind of do your own research on the internet, and I don't think that means very much either. That could lead you to trustworthy sources or not. And so I think there's a lot of mystery behind why we have this assumption of trust in these different contexts that's very invisible and feels distant. So that's also one of the reasons the Pulsar reading is in my sociology of health and illness class. And I think speaking to some of the questions that you have, I'm just thinking about, Jonathan Metzel's kind of like structural competence pitch, because I also discuss in my class thinking about how we've shifted from conversations about cultural competence and cultural humility in relation to just cultural differences between patient populations and the hospitals that serve them. But then I think also the structural competence issue is like taking into account all of these things that are informing how people come to hospitals, the vulnerability, which underscores the trust relationship. And I think some of the scholars who have been doing these reviews and synopses of the literature are also pointing towards sort of the need for, yes, this like broader understandings of structures and the two-way dynamic of the relationship. So having the assumption that patients should trust you, but also having the assumption, or what are the ways in which I might be suspicious of or not be taking into account these other circumstances, or recognizing all the things that are outside of their control that they can't influence, and that they're under so much constraint here. So what's the best that we can do in this interaction? Um, yeah.
So mute. So we have a couple of comments. One, I think is mostly primarily a comment, but you may have a reaction to, is just that the concept of active anti-racism seems very fruitful. And then prior to that was a comment, or was a question I need a little clarification on. It says, would you kindly advise both institutional and individually combating the racism responsible for the mistrust? Um, I'm not sure if I understand the the question about the, or the part about the advise part, but maybe you have a reaction to that.
Um, yeah, so thinking about first active anti-racism, I think I'm not sure if I'm totally familiar with that, other than like very much related to the 2021 pandemic moment was also George Floyd, and just I was at Johns Hopkins doing a postdoc, and there are a lot of moves to address the medical school curriculum, and embed a little bit more firmly structural competence, for instance, and having those conversations. And I think thinking about how useful active anti-racism is, but also realizing the constraints of a moment that's very anti-DEI, anti-explicit mention of race, kind of dismantling those structures of resistance that were built up. But for me, a lot of this taps into remembering that these are directives from the top down and like attempts at cultural control. And most of these efforts towards anti-racism or pushing institutions are from the bottom up. So it's not that, the university, for instance, thought it was such a great good to have departments of African American studies and Latino studies departments. It's that students demanded those things and forced the university to change. And so, right, these institutions are caught between different forces, like top-down directives, and also the demands that come from the people who make up these institutions. And so thinking about that relationship and trying to tie it to the anti-racism comment, and also thinking about, what constraints the institutions are under, but also the power that those bottom-up claims and movements and change that they have made. So even though we're in a moment of struggle, I think it's very important to that these movements are still going, these efforts are still going, these departments didn't appear by accident, these curriculum changes didn't appear by accident, and so they can't just be erased because there's a directive to do that.
Yeah, yeah. We have 1 minute left, and a couple of comments, unfortunately, are coming in right here toward the end. But let me try to get to one here, which is a little bit longer. I'll read it for us. It said, "Thank you for the great presentation and conversation. I'm a nurse, and nurses are proud to be the most trusted profession in the last several decades. However, I have concern that my colleagues use this broad statement without asking themselves about, quote, who are trusting us? Am I trustworthy?" End quote. Before assuming that we're trusted, before we're assuming that we're trusted, yeah. Do you have any advice for those nurses how to bring self-reflection before assuming you should trust me uh, before I'm a nurse? Yeah, and I would echo that same thing for physicians. Yeah,
Mhm, mhm.
advice for us to not assume that we should be trusted.
Um, yeah, I think I appreciate the question and the impulse. How do we not assume that? I mean, I think the point about these challenges and sort of these like loss of, I feel this in a very separate way, right? I'm not a physician or a nurse, but I am an academic. And so, thinking that people won't believe me of what I've come through, rigorous research by, firm methods and peer review publications, like thinking about just recognizing that not everyone, that's not meaningful to everyone. And so we have done work to convince ourselves that this is what structures and upholds our status, our advice. I think the point from Paul Starr has been really powerful about like the authority of medicine to shape patients' understanding of their own experience. I think understanding the power of patients' experience is lost sometimes in research and maybe through the everyday practice. So maybe at the same time that that's happening, finding ways to say, how can, like, shifting the question instead is like, how can personal experience teach me something that I don't know? How can their lived experience teach me something that I don't know? In what ways am I believing them when they tell me that? And in what ways am I questioning that because of these credentials? To maybe sort of think about this as relational, and healing that is to also ask those questions that they're asking of us and turn the lens a little bit.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Newman, I really want to thank you so much for sharing your expertise, sharing your time with us. You've given me lots and lots to think about, and I just greatly appreciate you helping us reframe this really foundational aspect of trying to provide healthcare. So thank you so much. If there are other questions that come in, we may forward those on to you and hope and see if you'd like to respond to those offline.
Yes, well, thank
Thank
you
you.
for the invitation. Thank you for the questions. I'm so pleased to join you.
Thank you all for attending. As always, Dr. Newman's talk will be a recording of the talk will be posted for your colleagues who aren't able to attend. Our next OBHC presentation will occur on Friday, January 9th at noon. We'll be hearing from Drew Grabham, who's the Director of Outreach and Strategy at Central City Concern here in Portland. He's going to be speaking on building resilience in our staff, a debriefing model for addressing moral injury. I hope to see you all there. Thank you for coming.